monsters, the Uncaged Anthology phenomenon. I'm Jess. You might see me down in the chat as Angry Nerd Girl, and I'm moderating today. I'm a writer from Uncaged Volumes 1 and 4, but I'm not who you're here to see. Let's meet our lovely panel, starting with Kat Evans. Tell us who you are and what you did with Uncaged.
I'm always first in introductions. I don't know why, I'm changing my name. I'm Kat Evans, and I've worked on all 4 of the Uncaged Anthology volumes, first as a writer, then as an editor, and finally as a layout artist.
Colette, welcome. Tell us who you are and what you did with Uncaged.
Hello, I'm Colette. Also, I use she, they pronouns, and I am a writer on Uncaged Volume 3. I wrote specifically the title The Serpent in the Sea, which is about the Naga.
David, welcome. Tell us who you are, what your pronouns are. Thanks, Colette. And what you did with Uncaged, for Uncaged.
I'm David. I use he, him pronouns, and I wrote Verdant Corruption for Volume 2. I did art in Volume 2, and also art in Volume 3 and 4, and did some layout for Volume 4.
Jess, tell us who you are, what pronouns you use, and what you did in Uncaged.
I'm Jess, Jess Ross, the other Jess. My pronouns are she or they. I wrote an adventure for Volume 1 called Swamped, and I was an editor on all 4 volumes.
Awesome. Christina, tell us who you are, what your pronouns are, and what you did in Uncaged.
Sure. Hi, I'm Christina, and I use she or they pronouns. My work in Uncaged is in Volume 1, and it is an adventure called The Weeping Woman.
And last not least, Liz, tell us who you are, what your pronouns are, and what you did in Uncaged.
Hi, I'm Liz Gist. My pronouns are they, them. I did art in volumes 1 and 3 and edited for the first 3 volumes.
Awesome. And for everybody who is here, if you haven't turned in your ticket yet, please do that. I'm going to have Nightbot remind you how to do that. And if you have any questions for the panel, put them in a chat and we'll grab them and we will answer them at the end. So I'm going to start by asking all of our panelists, who or what is your favorite monster? Anybody can go.
Hags. Hags. Sorry, did I take everyone's answer there?
Maybe.
My favorite are mephits, actually. I really love all of the different mephits. I like all of the elemental monsters of all kinds, except for I really don't like chewingos for a long, complicated reason that we don't have to get into, but pretty much all of the elementals I really like.
It's a solid choice. I think my favorite's probably Behirs. Like multi-legged, snakish monsters that breathe lightning and eat you, and then breathe lightning on you. I like it.
Dragons! There are never enough dragons in Dungeons & Dragons.
Thank you, Kat, because I would like to also say dragons. I don't know, I've just been on a kick of dragons recently, so they are currently my favorite monster. They're cute. I don't know why. I don't know why I think of them as just like cats, just giant cats that are scaly and breathe fire or other elements.
And are like terrifyingly smart.
Yes.
But also cats.
Yes.
I'm going to say demons because there are so many varieties and endless combinations and endless potential with so many, layers of the abyss. Also, demon princes. Awesome.
All right. I love that. And also, yes, we got congrats from the chat on the Any last night. So yeah, congrats everybody. And a huge congrats to Ashley, who organized this whole thing. Uncaged is really her baby, and we all wouldn't be doing this panel without her. So hi, Ashley. So I'm going to start with asking y'all some questions. I won't pick on Kat and ask first. I'll ask Jess, what inspired your adventure?
Sure. The inspiration for my adventure was the boo hag, which was the creature that was featured in my adventure. This is a creature that is part of like Southern Black folklore. Because specifically when thinking about what I wanted to write about, I basically started thinking about all of the stories my dad told me when I was a kid. My dad is from Mississippi, and I just sort of did some research on like, oh, what sorts of like folklore and myths are there in the region where my dad grew up, in like surrounding regions, that I think would be interesting to write about in a new way. And I came across the boo hag, who had a really interesting backstory that was also very like, oh, I wish that like she actually did this for herself and not for the boo daddy, which is sort of like what the history of the boo hag is that she like steals energy from people and takes it back to the boo daddy. And I was like, no, in this story, she does it to save her home because of gentrification and environmental collapse, because why not? But yeah, that was the inspiration for mine.
And that sounds really cool. I like that a lot. Christina, what about you?
I actually, had a similar process to Jess. I went back into the folklore of where my family's from, which is northern Mexico and Texas before it was, Texas. And I went into the legend of La Llorona. She is a woman who drowned her children, and it's based in pre-Hispanic mythology and religion. But the story has continued and evolved and is something completely different today than it was before the Spaniards came. And so I went into that with kind of that thought of this story is so many different things to so many different people, and looking at what does it mean when a woman is demonized? What does it mean when a story is told from multiple perspectives and how that can get twisted? And so that's what The Weeping Woman is about. You'll hear, playing through the story, you're going to hear many different versions of what happened to this woman, and you and your players will have to kind of decide what you think is true.
That's such a fun adventure. I love both of your adventures. So what about David?
So I'm actually probably totally different than than Jess and Christina. I started as an artist long before I started writing, so a lot of my inspiration for things comes visually. Like I'll get an image of something stuck in my head, and it'll just kind of sit there and gestate until it turns into something. And where I came from with writing for Uncaged was actually I had been running a couple different D&D campaigns, and some dryads came up in my campaign, and my players at the table immediately had thoughts about how the encounter was going to go. They there's like this kind of predetermined path of how meeting dryads goes in fantasy, where you meet the dryads, they try and seduce you, they take you to the forest, then you fight the charm, and then the dryads die, and that's the end of the story. So I really wanted to find a way to kind of subvert that story, and especially desexualize dryads, because it's just always been something that's bugged me. And I think about a month earlier, I'd watched Annihilation, and there's a scene in Annihilation where there's a soldier who dies, and the fungus kind of tears his body into pieces, and you see it kind of splayed out in this dazzle of color. And that kind of, I took that and merged it in with dryads, and that's kind of how Verdant Corruption came to be, and how the art for Verdant Corruption came to be too. So it was a little bit of kind of connecting something that had been in my head for so long with my motive of desexualizing dryads.
Do you find that your art influences your writing more than vice versa?
I think yes.
Okay.
Because when I kind of break down my writing process, it tends to be creating scenes and then finding ways to connect them. And a lot of the time, those scenes are very visual in my head and kind of break down into one of those, like when you see the big fantasy tableaus with the party fighting the dragon, and it's all from a certain angle. That's usually how every scene starts in my head, is what I want it to look like, and then kind of working backwards and finding ways to connect that and build it into my stories.
Cool. Well, Colette, what about you? What inspired your adventure?
So my adventure was about the Naga, which it's often in a South or Southeast Asian monster, typically like a serpent. It varies from different country or culture, so it could be just one long like serpent, or it's a serpent with like multiple heads, or like they look more akin to like mermaids. So it really depends on the culture and like which one you're deriving it from. But for me in particular, it was supposed to be based on the Cambodian and a little bit of Thai interpretation of the Naga. So it can so that interpretation involves like a serpent who can like shapeshift into like a human, or like kind of like a mix between like a serpent and a human, and also like a final form of like a multi-headed snake. But for me, my inspiration for this adventure was really just kind to go back to my own culture. So I'm actually both Chinese. I'm Chinese and I'm a little bit of Cambodian, mostly like culturally. That's where my dad grew up in. So actually, it was more like a kind of a cultural exercise of just trying to figure out, what is the Naga? It's something very, very akin to, that culture, and I don't really know much about it. So it was kind of like a time for me to do research and figure out what it was. But it was also kind of the inspiration of this adventure was to think about like the idea of like dungeon delving and like treasure hunting, which is something that, that's a core thing of D&D, is just going into dungeons and, finding treasure. But like kind of just taking that idea and like, what if you did go, or like, what if someone, or someone you in particular went dungeon delving and you took a treasure that actually meant something to someone, and like what are the repercussions of that. And also a little bit kind of what David said, I actually have a film background, so a lot of it was visual, and I also did really want to incorporate like, Southeast Asian culture. So you can't it's kind of hard in D&D of how do you incorporate like that visually. So I did a lot of like written text, like descriptions of the area, to make sure like it's not like, it's not a European style architecture. It's more Southeast Asian, as well as like, what are the color schemes of this area. So yeah.
That's awesome. What about you, Kat?
So mine was kind of historically influenced, because I am by training a classicist and an ancient historian, and I have a lot of feelings about how women who held any power in ancient societies get rewritten, often as demonic and often as seductresses, so like these very kind of lascivious sexual beings who ruin men and entire civilizations with their feminine charms. So that's what we have. In my adventure, we have a Lamia who was actually a very progressive ruler who built this kingdom into more than it ever was before. And as soon as they were chased out of the city, exiled for being too progressive and too terrifyingly powerful while daring to not be a dude, it immediately slipped back into like cultural erosion and even physical erosion, because the Lamia was just a badass, and they were kind of thinker and a scientist who figured out lots of ways to irrigate the city and make it a bustling, prosperous hub. And they kicked them out, rewrote their story, turned them into a terrible, slutty female who seduced a real hero. And we have a Lamia who's been in the desert for hundreds of years plotting their revenge. Because I think I didn't want to write it so that my monster wasn't a monster. I wanted to write it so that their monstrous nature was explicable and understandable. So yeah, that was my baby.
And Liz, you did a lot of art pieces for this. So how much inspiration comes directly from the text, and how much is kind of from other sources?
I'm going to be honest with you. I read each adventure except for Cats once initially.
Oh, I thought you were about to say you didn't read Cats.
No, Cats. For those who don't know, Kat and I are married, and so she would just pass it over to me in the late stages of like, please, there are 500 words over the limit. Where do I lose them? So when it came to her art, it was very collaborative, and Ashley actually initially brought us both on saying, okay, work together, please. And so like I was looking through Pinterest, and I still have my initial mood boards for all three of the pieces that I have, and they're like 70 for cats and images in there, and like 40 of them are lions, because I was like, how do lions work? But there were also like, the mood that I was trying to convey and to pick up on was very much influenced by Lepeta by Mocha, which is a series. And let's see. Oh no, it won't show. It's fine. But it's basically a powerful central figure that's like surrounded by followers. And then I got to kind of flip that for the one of the ones that I did for volume 3, and I'm so sorry. It was not Lynn. It was Sam Mannell's piece, but I am completely blanking on the title of the adventure right now because my memory is a sieve. But that one was very sort of flipped, where it was my original piece was from the point of view of the adventurers, and there was this proud figure standing surrounded by their court, and this other one was a very isolated figure who was a Medusa, and you were looking over the shoulder almost from the viewpoint of one of her snakes, out at this like hall of statues that had been like coming to attack her, and there were little teeny tiny adventurers way in the distance. And I actually for Pages Tale of Two Sphinxes, for Pages adventure with Sphinxes, my memory is terrible, it's so hot in the UK today. I worked with her the most, I think, to sort of draw out exactly what she wanted, because she had been working on this and holding on to it for a while, and so had a fairly clear image of what she wanted to convey. And it's a sort of, I think the thing that I love about all of the art pieces is that, just across the whole of Uncaged, is that all of them, there's a balance between, it can't be purely flipped, because then it's just sort of flat, but you have to maintain some level of mystique and monstrosity, but also make it more sympathetic.
I love that. So this, I'm going to ask Liz, but this also applies to a lot of you. You worked as an artist and an editor. A bunch of you worked as a writer and an editor. And David, you worked as a writer, an artist, and layout. So what was it like working in multiple roles on this project?
Between editing and art, it was a completely different experience, because with art, it was basically like the initial discussion with your author, and then you'd put her off and like share bits and pieces and you had them. Whereas and they would be excited whenever you sent them, because writers are excited to see their work brought to life. Whereas with editing, especially with people where it was sometimes their very first thing they'd ever written for like public consumption, and so it was a matter of treading carefully and trying to find the right language to use to say this area is weak and needs some work, because it's kind of going against the themes that you're trying to get across.
Can I just say that how Liz edits other people's adventures and how Liz edits my adventures are very, very different. I just get pages back with like chunks crossed out in red pen and the word "no" written in the margin.
So, Kat, what was it like for you then, moving from writer to editor?
Terrifying, because I realized just how bad my first draft was when I edited other people's. I was one of those people who, it was my first time writing an adventure for publication, and yet I somehow thought that, yeah, I can totally edit other people's. I have that knowledge. So I did that. And it was so exciting reading other people's adventures and seeing all of the different ways that they'd structured the story that they wanted to tell and all of the different influences that they'd drawn on. For me, it was mostly just a great opportunity to get to read like half of Uncaged 2 before it got published. It was amazing. But also there's a really nice feeling to being able to, I won't say help, but certainly like contribute to somebody's adventure. To be able to say, like, as a player, I am too stupid to understand how you want the scene to go. Could you explain it more, kind of thing? Or to say, this is really neat, but what happens if this? It just made the whole of Uncaged feel like a really cool collaborative process. And I think I didn't start to feel like part of the Uncaged family until I was editing.
What about for you, Jess?
I was definitely very nervous when I was writing. This was definitely my first time writing for TRPGs. It was my first ever adventure. But when I started editing, I felt much more confident in what I was doing, because even though Uncaged Volume 1 was my first time editing TRPGs, I've been an editor for over 10 years. So it was a much easier step to just change it to a new genre, because that is something I've done before. Like, I've edited for a bunch of different kinds of things. It's just that this is my first time for TRPGs. Similar, I think, to what Kat was saying, was that I definitely felt more involved in what was going on when I became an editor. I also feel like I learned so much more about writing when I started editing, that not that I felt like entirely unprepared or anything, but because it was my first time writing for TRPGs, there were definitely things that, like, if I were to do that over again, I have lots of ideas for like things that I would change just to like improve my adventure, which, I mean, it was my first ever adventure. I feel like that's very understandable. But it was stuff that I wouldn't necessarily have picked up on without becoming an editor.
On that, I would actually love to do like an Uncaged 2 or 3 years later, where we all do our current take on the adventures that we wrote like over 2 years ago now, just to see how we've all developed and changed. And I think it would be, I mean, Uncaged is an incredible book of adventures, so like just imagine how good it would be now.
I think Ashley might kill us if we propose that to her.
By this point, Uncaged is a machine that just runs on its own.
That's true.
Hey, Ashley, you know that thing that you just finished and is like out of your life now? It's back.
Let's do it all again.
David, what about you? Because you did more roles than anybody except maybe Ashley on this project.
Yeah, it actually wasn't so bad doing all the different roles, because the timelines of everything were really spread out. So like, I think it's probably been mentioned before, but all the writing for all 4 volumes was upfront. It all happened before the first volume ever came out. So doing writing, like writing was said and done, edited, proofed, and everything before I even started doing art for volumes 2, 3, and 4. And then by the time layout came out or it came time to do layout for volume 4, all the art was already like months done. So it wasn't, when you take on like multiple roles on another project that might have a shorter timeline, it tends to have things overlapping on each other and causing ridiculous amounts of stress, because you're not sure what you should be doing at any point in time. But this one wasn't too bad because it was so spread out. But I think that the same feelings that that Kat and Jess had about editing and feeling more involved in everything was the same when I was doing art for other people's adventures. because I started doing my own adventure and then I did my own art right after that. But I had never actually done art for anybody else before. I'd published adventures and I'd published lots of my own stuff and done lots of my own art, but I'd never done it for somebody else before. And taking that step and having to learn, like, how do you do art for somebody else instead of art for yourself? Because when you write something, you know exactly the moment you want to portray, what the most important part is. And when you come to someone else's adventure, trying to figure out what that point is and like what's going to make what the writer wants to have show up, and what you think is the best thing might not always be the same. And just especially with an anthology like this, where every adventure had its own like full page piece of artwork, and especially like the way that it was laid out, where it had the art was the very first thing you saw. So it's going to be the two things that are influence people's opinion of the adventure first is the art piece and the title. And having to kind of grapple with that is something like, so I think like I did a bunch of back and forth with the writers that I worked with, but I think in both of the cases that I worked with other writers, they didn't have a clear idea of what they wanted. And Jess, I don't think you had a clear idea of what you wanted for yours when I worked on it either. So it was a lot of just like reading through the adventure and trying to find out what that place, what that most important moment was that would kind of encapsulate the whole adventure and draw people in. It would make them want to find out what the heck's going on in that artwork.
Just to add to that, I'm going to say, they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but we had to condense 3,000 words into one picture.
Yeah, I usually like, especially with when I was working on Morgan's adventure in Volume 3, and of course now I looked up the name of it earlier, but now I can't remember it because I'm here. But for that one, I actually spent time going through all of the box text, because I kind of thought about it as like, if a writer is writing box text, they want you to see exactly what they see in their head. They don't want to give you a bland general description. They want to tell you this is what it looks like. So I figured those are probably the parts that are going to be most important.
I think you touched on something that I think a lot of writers are just really excited to see any of their text in a picture form. I think we get really excited, just like, oh, that came from what I wrote, and it's really exciting.
And I think it irritates artists sometimes because we're just like, literally anything you do is going to be the coolest thing I've ever seen. You can't make me angry. You can't upset me. Like, draw a stick figure. I'll love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a struggle sometimes. You're like, just point me in the direction. Do you want like the beginning, the end, a character, a setting? What's important? And they're like, well,
anything, everything, simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. That's why I resort to reading box text.
That's great for people like me who don't use box text. So a couple of you mentioned that this was your first thing that you had ever published for TTRPGs. Can we get a show of hands on if Uncaged was the first thing that you had ever done for TTRPG publication? Oh my gosh. This is so cool. David, you had done Gimbel's Guide to the Feywild before, right?
Yep. That was, I think, 3 or 4 months before we started work on Uncaged. Okay. And then I put out a couple random other things before that aren't noticeable.
Oh, heck no, I'm sorry. I released a hag-based warlock patron before Uncaged, but Uncaged was the learning experience.
So for everybody else, or actually for everybody, but particularly those of you who just, this was our first thing, how have things changed for you since Uncaged, if at all?
I'm now a full-time RPG writer with about 6 books coming out this year, so it's been a pretty dramatic change.
Yeah, same here. It's been when I wrote for Uncaged Volume 1, I was still in academia, so I was still a teacher basically at a local college here. And Uncaged was sort of the first thing I had done in a long time that wasn't directly related to academia, and sort of made me remember that there are other things out there. So almost, I think right before Uncaged released, I switched to full-time freelance because I was also freelance editor while I was teaching, and I've been doing that ever since. Although now I am working at Dungeons and Dragons, but like even that is a huge shift from like what I used to do.
I was I was only kind of doing art for myself back then, and it's kind of been the catalyst that's launched me into now being a freelance artist, with like picking up gigs and actually doing art for people's books. Yeah, I've also would not have made some of the best friends that I have if it wasn't for Uncaged.
I would second the community around Uncaged is fantastic. I was so excited to see everyone's faces when we signed on to the call, just because, I've seen your pictures, but like interacting in person, pseudo person, was very exciting. And I would also say that it's given me the confidence to go forward with maybe a portfolio in a networking perspective to somebody and say, this is something I'm really proud of. I'd love to work on something with you. Whereas before I was like, wow, I wish I could do that. I wish. And now I have, gone to conventions and I have met people and I have networked. So it's just really exciting to have something physical to be able to show somebody that's like, yes, I am capable of doing this. And, I've gotten work since then. So it's really exciting.
I think
So, I guess, okay, I'll go. So I think for me, so at the time of like Uncaged just getting started, I just graduated like undergrad, so I was just kind of just like something for me to do, and I think from there, like what everyone's been saying, it's kind of just took off from there. I've been working, like publishing other adventures in other anthologies. I think earlier my parents asked me like, so you published 3 books, and I'm like, now it's 7. And it's been great. I think since like now, actually currently, I'll be starting graduate school, doing game design at interactive media and game design at USC. So in my portfolio, in like my application, I just talked about Uncaged, and in my interview for them, I literally was just talking about Uncaged. And they're like, yeah, it's like they were really intrigued, like interested about like me, like my background in analog and like tabletop RPG. So it was really great. And, like also I've been getting like also contract work and other stuff that I've been doing as like a freelance writer. And also I have the confidence, thanks to kind of the other Uncaged folks who are like spearheading spin-off projects, for me to do a spin-off project, to restart that. This past couple months have been busy, so I had to be like, we're on hold for right now. But I think I got the confidence from this community to like actually spearhead like a project as well.
You want to tell us about that project?
Yes. A couple of you are actually on it, and I was like posted it, but I think it is just thanks to Jess and also TK, who are having a conversation about Book of Seasons and brought up like the idea of like creepy monsters. I was like, let's do it. And there's currently in the works like just a monster manual of just creepy monsters. It'll be coming out eventually at some point. We're working on it.
Also, anytime, I do want to say the Uncaged Discord is so full of ideas of people putting forth new projects, and Colette organizes all of the ideas in a massive spreadsheet. So all of the Uncaged spin-off projects that have happened because Colette is organized. And that brings me to David, who released the very first one.
Yeah. So the first Uncaged spinoff was called Friends, Foes, and Other Fine Folks. And it kind of came about because we started talking, I think, about all the NPCs in our modules for Uncaged and how a lot of them kind of broke the molds on what you typically see in adventures and how everyone needs more of those. And so we ended up with this collection of, I want to say it was 54 or 55 NPCs that went into the book. And we had about 45 people work on the book. And about half of them were from Uncaged, and the other half were people that might as well have been Uncaged. We call them the Uncaged extended family because they're all people who could have easily written for Uncaged, but didn't have the chance to. So yeah, that came out last year and has people or NPCs who are of different or represent different racial backgrounds, NPCs with disabilities. Of course, I'm blanking now because it's been a long time since I've
Portal.
Sorry?
I drew a Portal. One of the NPCs that I got to draw for it was a reporter turtle, and it remains one of my favorite things I've ever drawn because he's just got this little reporter's hat and notebook.
Mm-hmm. That was Noah's NPC, I think, who did the writing for that. But yeah, it was awesome. I think the best part of doing that was actually the same way that Ashley brought on so many people into Uncaged who were doing things for the first time. Friends, Foes, and Other Fine Folks brought on a lot of other people who had never done anything before, who are now going out and doing their own things. And I think there was at least about 20 people there who it was their very first publication as well.
I love that book. And Kat, you also spearheaded a massive publication.
I did. Well, fortunately, I decided not to do it solo. Alicia Furness, who was also in Uncaged Volume 1, and I had just a really casual conversation on Twitter where we said, what about an anti-capitalist D&D project? And then suddenly we had a 4-book anthology collection on our hands. It's called Etheridge. The first volume is on DM's Guild, and the rest of the adventures are like slowly making their way out as zines on Drive-Thru RPG. It's part Uncaged family and part every angry punk on Twitter, I think, who are like the extended Uncaged family. Like the ones that you only invite to wedding receptions, not weddings, because they're kind of sloppy and messy. Love you, friends. But yeah, I did that for some reason. I suddenly can't hear anyone else.
Jess, you're
I muted myself and then forgot about it. So, yeah, for David and Kat, what was it like going from Uncaged to running a massive project?
Well, I did have help on it, which was nice. Paul definitely gave me a lot of help on it. But I think it kind of makes you realize how much work it is. Like there's this kind of crash where I think when Ashley was running Uncaged, we saw lots of updates and we saw lots of like encouragement. And I think when you start running your own project, you realize how much mental work that actually takes. Even just being there to answer questions like pretty much any time of the day, and replying to emails and giving people who are struggling encouragement. Like, it seems like it's not a big thing, but I think that the biggest thing I've learned about running projects is the most important thing is just encouraging people and being there to say, you're doing a great job. You can definitely do this. Just go ahead and do it and you'll do great. And then afterwards, telling them how much you love what they've done. I think that's probably the biggest impact that you can make as the person in charge.
Yeah, I think that's probably my only real regret, as much as I complain about the scale of it with Eat the Rich, is that we had so many people that it was really, really hard to give people that like personal encouragement and always be available for questions and things like that. And we lost a lot of people along the way, and that's really saddening in retrospect, because I think if we put more thought into the setup and thought about like the size of project that we could easily manage, I think we could have given everybody who was on the project like not just an okay, but a really great experience. And I wish we'd done that. So what I learned is don't do projects with 200 people on.
So the name of this panel is Reclaiming the Monster. That was the goal of Uncaged. But I want to ask all of you, like, what does reclaiming the monster mean to you, and how do you want to go about doing that in your future work?
Okay, so to me it means making the monster understandable. Because a lot of fantasy role-playing games, the monsters are bad because they're bad, right? And you're the good guys because you're the good guys and you fight the monster. But going back earlier to talking about some of our favorite monsters like hags and dragons and dryads, they're all creatures with really long lives and really like rich histories and personalities. So what I want to do when I reclaim a monster is look at why these creatures that are as much part of the world as the adventurers come into conflict with other groups, and how to resolve that in a way other than kill it because it's bad.
Yeah, I definitely want to think beyond putting the monster in a dungeon to be a big scary thing. It has an environment, it has a reason to be in the ecosystem that it is. So what is it doing for the space that it's in? So really giving it a purpose, giving the monster a purpose. That purpose can be evil, and that's okay. So just thinking about broader scope. Yeah.
I think for me, when I was like doing how I reclaimed the monster, I actually didn't mention earlier that I actually wrote I wrote another monster stat block actually in the appendices of Uncaged Volume 4. I actually wrote the Yuki Onna, which is actually the person behind me in my virtual background. But for both both the Naga and the Yuki Onna, I was kind of thinking it more of like the cultural impact and the cultural significance of those beings, because they're pretty prominent or big monsters or like creatures in their own cultural background. So like for the Naga, for me to reclaim the monster, specifically for the Naga, is that it has been kind of like skewed and changed in a European Western centric background, and like a lot of people when they think of Naga, it's different. For example, like in the D&D monster manual is completely different than how I interpret the Naga, as well as, for example, another prominent one is like Warcraft, and like the Naga are very much different. I think they really just use the term to just say like, oh, look how exotic this character, this monster is. And I think with the Yuki Onna, even though had a monster stat block, it was just that I did have like a brief written kind of like summary or like intro for it, and I was writing it in the sense that how people's retellings and people's stories of these monsters change from person to person, because a lot of, at least from my perspective, like a lot of Asian cultures, their stories are told orally through like folk tellings, like around just having a story told, and oftentimes stories are interpreted, things are changed. And so for when I was writing the Yuki Onna, my intention was to not specifically say that the Yuki Onna is a bad monster or bad ghost who died in the snow, who's gonna take your soul by like smooching you. It also had, because there's different interpretations of the Yuki Onna, so I made sure to include, like, it could be bad or it could be good, but these are the reasons why it's bad or good, and it's up to you to retell that story within that context. So it was it's kind of just bringing it back to how they were told in like originally, and what it meant to a lot of people that monster comes from.
Yeah, I think that what Colette's saying really kind of hits to something that I always tried to do too.
Oh no, David froze.
Oh dear.
The anticipation is building.
Oh no.
While we're waiting to see if he returns, I can say from an artist's perspective that a lot of it came from taking. A lot of these are very feminine monsters by like intention. It's the whole purpose of the anthology, and taking those and stripping away the really gross factors that always get interpreted into the art when it's for an assumed male audience, like giving them personality, giving them more than just boobs hanging out there with a couple strips of fabric. Actually figuring out how to visually tell a story with these beings instead of just having them be monsters on the page.
David, want to give it another shot?
Sure. I was just saying that the every time that something shows up in like especially popular culture, it kind of puts a layer over top of what the old myth is. And I think Naga is a really good example because it's been retold so many times, and especially when you start getting into like World of Warcraft, it's something that's not related to the myth of a Naga at all. So trying to peel back all those new expectations of something and all those stories that are told about it to get to the root of what it actually is. You're muted, Jess.
Oh, it was my fault. I was asking, what about you, Jess?
I mean, very similar to what other people have been saying about reclaiming monsters. I do try to look for trying to veer away from the very gendered descriptions of monsters that I see, because that is often the case when you see a monster that is more like feminine presenting. Usually that monster has features that are, or a history of very much like, oh, this monster like seduces adventurers, and this monster is a monster because like something to do with, you know, they were attacked or lost a child. Like that is, it seems like that is always the history behind feminine monsters. So redirecting that to something else, I think, goes a long way. Giving them actual stories, which is what either like more masculine looking monsters or even monsters that don't seem to present any gender even get more of an opportunity to have stories aside from they're a woman. It's like, you know, sometimes you see a show where you have like a cast of 5 and it's like this guy is the smart one and this one is the sporty one and this one is this one and also the girl, and like that's her personality, and that's sort of what it feels like sometimes with these monsters. And even like any monster at all, because so much of in any like TRPG you see, any monster, and other people have mentioned this too, if they are like evil aligned, that's just their thing. Like they are evil and there is not any real reason for it. And like every single monster you come across that is that kind of monster is going to be evil for the same reasons. And that just isn't anything. So like changing that and like giving them a reason to be evil, or even giving them a reason to be seen as evil when they're not actually evil. It's just the way other people have been telling their story, other people have been reacting to what they've been doing. To me, that is makes a lot of sense as a way to sort of reclaim a monster and either turn it into something else or just give it its own story so that it's more than just like they're evil for the sake of being evil, or they're evil because they are feminine, because that's basically what that comes down to so often.
Yeah. So Uncaged has gotten a lot of deserved credit for changing the DMs Guild and changing kind of the look of who's writing in the TTRPG scene in the last year and a half. And I want to know what further changes all of you would like to see.
So many.
Go ahead.
I would say a celebration of marginalized voices. We can show up, we can write things, we can be in the space, but until we are celebrated and lifted up, we're only going to be distributing our content to each other.
Definitely the celebration thing. I agree with you so much on that, especially because something I've noticed over the past couple of months is I've been getting tagged in a lot of things, which is not a bad thing. Like I'm very grateful that people are sort of saying like, oh, and also like Jess, check out Jess's stuff. But this is definitely something that came up as a result of what's going on in the US right now, that people have been putting in the effort to say like, let's really lift up Black creators right now, which is great, and I'm glad they're doing it. But I don't like that it took all of that for that to start. And I can already see it dropping off significantly. So if the community could actually do that celebration of all of the diverse voices that are here in times other than when things are going horribly for us, like I think that would be a huge improvement. And even the people who were like doing these lists of like, hey, here are some Black creators you might not know about, it ended up being like the same, 10 to 15 people almost every time. And like, as much as I appreciate people shouting me out, I'm not the only Black editor. I'm not the only Black writer. And I'm not the only like person of color out there. Like there are so many of us. It would be nice if people would put in more of an effort, especially the people who have that really huge audience who are doing a lot of these things, could really put in that effort more often than just like, oh, hey, is like every Black person I know right now is like in their house devastated because of everything that's going on. Here's a list of Black creators. Like give that to everyone, even when things are going well, which may never happen again is what it feels like right now. But you know what I mean? That like get like lift up all of those diverse voices, lift up, everyone, even when it's not a matter of us being in the news because of everything horrible going on. But also like aside from that, there are so many things that I would like to see changed in the industry that it's hard to pick just a few and not just like go off on it for the next 5 years. So I think I'll keep it with that for now.
Anybody else?
For me, I think one of the changes that, well, first off, a lot. But I think one of the changes I'd like to see is kind of like seeing a more diverse range of like systems that we can do that isn't just like Dungeons and Dragons or like the 5e system. I think it's important to have that kind of diversity because I think there's different stories that we can tell through different systems. And I think a lot of us did start writing in like Dungeons and Dragons because they are trying to break into the industry and that is the premier thing, but maybe it's not something that people necessarily enjoy. And like I think having I want to see change is also like having a lot of diverse forces that aren't just working like freelance or independently through like DM's Guild or like Drive Through RPG, just like having the opportunity to come like to see our work through the freelance work we do, but and then like have us on board on like actual companies or like as like a full-time position, because as much as like freelancing is great and we are able to like write the stories that we do, it's financially not the greatest thing to do in terms of like, I'm assuming a lot of us have like second jobs. This is actually our like night job because we enjoy doing it.
I think I'll
Yeah.
probably, because I think these are all pretty big things. So I'm going to go on to a small thing. Is that I think one of the things that would actually help with having a lot of the smaller creators maybe shown off more, or find some other mechanisms other than just the top list that we see on the DM's Guild. Because a lot of people, I think, are really good creators but don't have art budgets or layout budgets or the skills to do those things. Like, I think that we've got a lot of really good creators on the DM's Guild, but we've got maybe 20 or 30 big good creators on the DM's Guild, and they tend to push everybody else out of the way a lot of the time. Like, and I think it's harder for new people to get traction, especially if they don't walk in with hundreds of dollars to throw at art. So I think if we had some other mechanisms to kind of highlight that other than just what's selling the best right now, it would probably go a long way.
This isn't something I'd like to see happen, it's something that's already happened. There's now a project called the Compass Community Fund, which is being run by DM's Guild creators, and I think ERF Jordan might be spearheading it. But it's a community fund that aims to give small creators access to a budget for art and layout and anything else they need to help them stand out and make a professional product. So yeah, everybody should go look that up and use that. It's awesome.
Also, shout out to the RPG Writers Workshop for a great place to, talk to other creators and network and, get folks on board with what you're trying to make.
And congrats on your Any Last Night RPG Writers Workshop.
And congrats to several people on this panel who are instructors on the RPG Writers Workshop.
Oh, I thank you. So, what advice do all of you have for anyone who wants to do this?
It's going to sound really cliche, but just do it. You might look back in 6 months' time and go, oh, that wasn't great, but you did it. And everything that you make after the first thing will always be better.
Yeah, I mean,
best advice I think there is.
fail fast, fail in a different way next time, basically. But when I started writing my Uncaged adventure, I found it really, really hard to come up with, like, I could come up with cool scenes, I could come up with cool concepts for an adventure. I found it really, really hard to make a coherent narrative that was, both a strong story and easy for players to interact with and influence. And now, after 2 years of just constantly working that design muscle, what have we come up with in the last week? There's like 4 different game ideas. So yeah, just do it and keep doing it. Yeah.
I read something.
I would say definitely either finding or building a community is really important. Anytime anyone asks me like how to get into the TRPG like world industry, my first piece of advice is to check out the RPG Writers Workshop. I also ran through it, and it was so incredibly helpful for me when I was getting my start, and even like review it. Like I have re-registered before too, just to like get a refresher on all of the classes and see the new stuff that comes through. And there's such great information. It's so useful, and having any sort of community where you can talk with other people who are also creating is incredibly useful, and having other people to bounce ideas off of having other people to support you and being able to support other people, having just sort of like a cohort of accountability buddies where you all work together and try to accomplish this thing together. I think if my first time in TRPGs hadn't been with Uncaged Anthology, I probably would not have ended up publishing anything. I would have hit a point where I felt like, I'm too unsure of myself. I have too little motivation. Like I don't feel confident enough putting this thing out. So being able to be part of that community for my first time, I think made a huge difference in how everything worked out for me.
Anybody else? Okay, well, we had some questions from chat. And if anybody else has a question, put it into the chat and we will get to it. But starting with Jay, what creature would you love to give the uncaged treatment to?
Aboleths. There's so much there. A sentient ancient being. I mean, come on.
For me, it's Drow. I don't feel like they're mine to reclaim because there are so many problems with the Drow. But also, they're just the best / worst example of evil because women. And I really want to get in there and like fix them from the ground up.
I've always wanted to tackle Zagatmoy because she's just so... They're so cool. Just everything about her is so cool, but I find there's no real meat to her stories. Like there's not enough in the background of who, why, what, other than just hand-waving some demon lord.
Dragons. I love dragons, and I think while like there's not enough dragons in Dungeons and Dragons, and I ever since I started playing D&D, I've always had a gripe with why the fact that like chromatic dragons and like metallic dragons have a specific alignment. Alignment is doesn't exist. But yeah, so I think kind of just doing just focusing a lot more on dragons, dragon adventures.
Do you want to do a dragon book together? Because I want to do dragons as well, and nobody wants to write dragons with me.
Let's do it.
Oh
no!
Dragon book.
This is how it happens. Oh no!
This is what the Uncaged chat looks like every day, guys.
Oh no! Let's do this. Oh no!
Like I would write a plaid dragon. Anybody else have a monster they want to reclaim? Okay. Then the Lionel asked, what is the most unique way you saw a monster reclaimed in someone else's adventure in the anthology?
Paige Lightman's Women in Tech, Women in STEM Sphinx. She's this Sphinx who kidnaps bad people, regresses them to children, and experiments with behavior modification to make them better grown-ups second time around. And I love it. You love to see women in STEM in any context.
I have to plug my friend Sarah Sharker. She's in volume 4, and she just kind of wrote a story about how a werewolf wants to have a birthday party, and they have hats. They have little birthday hats, and it's so good. The concept is just very like, you wouldn't expect a werewolf to want a birthday party, but they're human. They want a birthday party.
It totally drew that werewolf in the birthday hat.
I was about to say, David, you did that hat. The werewolf hat. Anybody else have an adventure you want to shout out?
It's tough to choose just one because so many people did put in so much work to reclaim each of their individual monsters. And there's also sort of looking into like what does it mean to reclaim it to each person. Definitely like the adventure I always shout out when talking about Uncaged is Kat Kruger's Wild Hunt. I love that adventure and I love the Kumiho in that adventure. Um, yeah, but yeah, definitely in general, like it's tough for me to pick just one to say like this I feel like was the most unique or the most interesting because I think everyone did something slightly different with their like they interpreted like reclaiming that monster slightly differently for themselves. And so each one was very different and each one worked differently within their adventures. And it was definitely like if anyone listening has not just like reviewed all of the Uncaged adventures, go read all of them because they all do really amazing things.
Or come watch Three Flings on this channel every Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern because we're playing through every single adventure.
I want to shout out Nemo's adventure from Volume 1, Guardians of the Forest, The Guardian of the Forest. They had multiple monstrous people in their adventure, and my players latched right on to the ogre NPC that Nemo wrote, and there's so many layers. So if you haven't checked out or played that adventure, go check it out.
Anybody else? I know that she just left chat, but I'm going to shout out The Secret of Shadow Grove by Lynn Meyer because that's an adventure basically where there's a hag who is doing bad hag things in a town, but the town loves the hag and she's basically made the town safe for women. She's still doing some really evil, nasty things, but because that's what she does, but the town is grateful to her and worships her and keeps her safe. And it really makes adventurers think about like how much do they want to disrupt this town's entire way of life to save this one guy who is clearly doing wrong versus destroying a hag because hag. And I thought that was very cool. It made my players think a lot. So another question that we had was, when drawing on myths and legends from other cultures, how does one tread the line between cultural appreciation and appropriation?
So for Kat's art, the very early talks that we had, we discussed Muka, but we also discussed like drawing from sort of Mesopotamian feel without just directly lifting it, so that it wasn't just appropriating a culture that neither of us have a connection to. And so for me, that was largely a process of falling down a Pinterest hole, honestly. It was looking at that sort of fashion and then drawing on that and interpreting it in using like Greek influences as well, and just kind of expanding beyond that to say, okay, here are similar shapes and here are similar fashions, but not directly lifted. It's things that are broadly inspired by. So it's really a matter of just absorbing as much as you can and coming at it with a respect and an understanding instead of just stealing outright.
I just want to jump in and say that the cultures depicted in my adventure are actually they're not Mesopotamian, they're Ionic Greek, which is like ancient Greek colonies in Turkey, with a certain amount of archaeological and stylistic influence from Mesopotamia, which is another neighboring culture. Sorry, it's tough because we're talking about an adventure that was written and illustrated like a couple of years ago. But where I'm going with that is that I try to stick to cultures that I have like some experience of. I'm not culturally Greek, but I am by training a person who understands like Greek cultural influence in the European tradition. So I try to pull from myths and legends in the way that they've been adapted through cultures and cultural experiences that I am part of, if that makes sense.
The appropriation versus appreciation conversation is a really difficult one every time. And I often recommend for people to hire a diversity consultant or cultural consultant, a sensitivity reader, anything like that, as part of what they're doing to write about a culture that is not their own. However, that is also sort of a definitely like any like discussion or thought that someone is having about like, oh, I wonder if this is treading the line too much. It shouldn't just fall on their consultant to make that decision for them. There's definitely a high level and like there's a lot of like critical thinking that needs to take place before someone even like hires a consultant like that. Because I think there are lots of questions we can be asking ourselves in terms of like, why am I telling the story? Why do I feel like the story needs to be told? Is it a story that like truly I believe needs to be out there, or is it just something that I want to borrow from because I think these parts are fun and interesting, which is something that like needs to be examined. And then even if it is the case that like you're feeling like I just truly feel like the story needs to be told, then the next question is, so why do I feel like I'm the right person to tell it? So there are a lot of questions I think that people can ask themselves about like to try to examine where they feel like they fall on that line of appreciation versus appropriation. Because it's also always going to be the case that like once a person makes that decision for themselves, they've made that decision. So even if they do hire a sensitivity reader or a cultural consultant, but they've already decided, yes, it's appropriate for me to tell this story, like they've made that choice. And that it's not always a good thing. It's not always a bad thing. It is what it is, but it's difficult even for someone, in my experience at least, even for someone who is at the point where they've said like, this story needs to be told and I feel like I am the one to tell it. Even if they do then hire a sensitivity reader or a cultural consultant, it's not always the case that they will be open to what that consultant has to say. So I think there are a lot of questions that anyone who's writing about anything to do with a culture other than their own needs to they need to examine a lot within themselves and like why they're telling that story. They need to ask themselves a lot of questions. To me, there is no one answer to that question. There is no one way to examine the line between appreciation and appropriation because it is such a difficult topic. But it is always a good sign to me that anyone is considering that question, that they're questioning that about themselves and about their writing. I think that is a good place to start, and from there like asking yourself a lot of questions and then making sure if there's anything, like no matter how small it seems or how much of it is like inspiration versus like copying something, like if there is anything that you know is from another culture, I would say make sure you hire a cultural consultant no matter how small you think it is.
Thank you, Jess. You just said everything that I didn't know how to say. I would advise hiring multiple, because assuming that one culture is a monolith is an assumption that should not be made. So you should have multiple perspectives from a culture to get a really good view if you do make that decision that you're the best person to tell that story, and then listen to them, like actually listen to them and take the feedback and do something with it. And if possible, work with them from the very beginning, from the conceptualization, because you can stop a lot of things before you get started that you then might get married to, in your mind or in your creative process. So from the beginning.
I think so. When I was doing my adventure, I was working with Sandy, who's a white artist, and while she does have some like background in like like Chinese and other Asian, but specifically Chinese like design. She was still very open in like hearing what I wanted out of the piece. But when specifically, because I specifically a lot of people get Asian culture as a monolith. And I think one of the main reasons is that it's just everyone paints it as one specific thing, when like specific countries and even like countries in the same regions, like one, like maybe like one culture over, it's completely different. But it's just understanding specifically what are the pieces that go into the culture. Like, for example, like when I was working with my artist, I specifically said, I want this, I want this specific type of clothing that is specific to Cambodia, just in case it just gets misinterpreted, because, you know, a lot of people, for example, they kind of blend like Korean, for example, Korean like traditional Korean wear with Chinese traditional wear, and it just, that bothers me. So it's like very like, first definitely hired like a diversity consultant or just someone who has the knowledge and background. But if for some reason you really want to tell the story and you cannot find someone to do it, like this is like somehow you forgot, you just are at that, it's your only option, you're gonna have to do the research enough if you can. But you're gonna have to be very specific, and you're gonna have to spend a long time doing it if you're doing it on your own.
I think that probably gets to something about doing art for other people. Just in general, is that sometimes you end up with kind of an art brief where you don't have all the pieces. So as an artist, it falls on you to do visual research, find references, and then go back and ask questions. Did I use the right visual references? Does this fit with what you're trying to show as the writer, what it should look like? And making sure that you're not generalizing, because I think we all, just from things that we've seen, build up a visual library in our heads. And sometimes you have to break your own visual libraries and realize that you were wrong, that something that in your head looked like something doesn't actually look like that.
All right, we've got one last question from chat, and it is from Clove Latte. If you could pick one physical item to come from the Uncaged world, what would it be? Dice, DM screen, safety cards, etc.
Plushie of a werewolf and a birthday hat.
I think safety cards probably would be one of the most uncaged things that could be uncaged branded. Although, I mean, we are doing tarot cards and stuff, so.
Shout out Luciella Scarlett, who is one of the Uncaged artists who made safety cards, and I'm going to drop them in the chat right now. But I would love Uncaged safety cards. Sorry, go ahead.
This is a very silly one, but I just want a sticker or a pin that says "Too much lesbians." Or they're all lesbians, because one of our first negative reviews on Volume 1 was someone complaining that everyone was lesbian, and it just became a meme within the community.
I would definitely wear Ramp Up the Lesbian merch. 100%. I want a hat.
Kat or Jess?
I would love to see an Uncaged interpretation on a DM screen, because every TRPG that has its own like GM screen puts slightly different information on the like DM facing side. And I would be very curious to see the Uncaged interpretation of like what is the information that's most important to have facing the DM. And I also think an uncaged DM screen would do something that I haven't seen on DM screens before, which is also put like player facing content on the other side of it. And I feel like it's hard for me to decide right now in the moment like what exactly that would be, but I feel like if it came from Uncaged, whatever information ended up on both sides would be really interesting, and it would be really unique to Uncaged specifically, and something that I wouldn't have seen on other DM screens before. So that is definitely something that like now I am thinking about like what if I were to make a DM screen, which I'm not going to do this. Don't do this to me. I see these looks. Don't start. I don't have time.
I see Colette opening the spreadsheet.
I feel like an Uncaged DM screen would also not be designed for 6 foot tall cis men, which means you would actually be able to see your players over it.
But like, what if there were cards where you could like insert the monster card so your players could see who they were talking to? Like there was a. I'm sorry. This is.
Oh,
I'll save
pretty?
it.
It's
of course. You know, we could have like a monster deck with some little information, like their pronouns, and you know, I'm gonna save it for the spreadsheet.
Funny enough, I actually haven't opened the spreadsheet in quite a while, so thanks for kicking my butt to open it. But also, I don't know why when you said like an Uncaged DM screen, I feel like on both sides there'll just be like a list of critical thinking questions. It's like, is this okay? On both ends, like, is this okay?
All with Medusa just judging you in the middle.
Just like stop, think. Critical think, is this good? If it's not, you should stop. That's just one of the panels.
Anybody else with some Uncaged merch they want in the real world? Okay, well, we had one last question, and I will answer it before we say our goodbye. From, what was it, a gamer girl? That was, what is Uncaged's future, and how can a new creator get involved? So I know Ashley has floated the idea of a possible all tier 4 module tackling reclaiming the goddesses of the D&D world. I don't know when it will be, or if Ashley's still relaxing from producing 4 massive volumes. I hope she takes all the time that she needs. But I will put the Uncaged Anthology website in the chat, and I would say to check that out, and also check out Ashley's Twitter for open calls for things like that. Or just follow any of us on Twitter, because we do open calls for projects all the time. And then join the massive Uncaged adjacent family, because we're kind of growing and expanding like weird monsters. So thank you so much for coming, everybody. This was so wonderful. And thank you to our lovely panelists. So let's see, tell us who you are and where we can find all of you, starting with Liz.
Hi, I am a really bad lighting now. Liz Gist. You can find me on Twitter at crit_Liz, or you can find me on Instagram at critliz, just one word. I'm available for commissions and whatever else you have, and eventually getting a queer anthology off the ground for D&D. So keep an eye out for that.
Christina.
Hi everyone, I'm Christina Sisto Kindle, and you can find me on Twitter at D20xtina. I'm not running any projects, but I would like to plug a recent work that I did that I'm really proud of. For Pathfinder, I worked on Lost Omens Legends, which is a NPC book that's really exciting, and let me tell you, we ramped up the lesbians.
Jess.
I'm Jess. You can find me on Twitter at WriteJessR, and you can find all of the stuff that I do on my website, writejess.com. You can also find me tomorrow playing D&D with the D20 Dames as part of Gen Con, and you can check out at D20 Dames on Twitter to get more information, or like search the Gen Con website. It's tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Pacific time. It's, I don't know, afternoon on East Coast time. Like 1? I don't know. What even are time zones?
David.
I'm David. I'm on Twitter at David Markowski because I'm boring like that. And I write and draw, and just had a book come out this week called The Wayfinder's Atlas, which is kind of cool. So you should check that out. But yeah, that's about it. I don't really have a whole lot going on right now.
Colette.
Hello, Colette again. You can find me on Twitter, also at Colette Kwok. So it's just kind of my first name, last name. Someone stole my usual username that I do for my online thing, so it's kind of didn't really think of anything else. I may be opening for commissions. I gotta fund my grad school somehow, y'all. And like I said, I'm currently working and spearheading a creepy monster compendium that you'll get updates. I will most likely actually start using my Twitter again. I also wrote on Wayfinder's Atlas. I'm sorry, I've been so bad with social media, so I was like, I feel bad that I'm not publicizing this. But I wrote a castle stuck in a pocket dimension with ghosts everywhere. It's great. And I also wrote on a 5e system called Unbreakable, which technically is a D&D, but it's also 5e, so it doesn't have to be D&D, about all Asian. It's an all Asian creative team where we just kind of wrote different adventures, and I think it's a second volume is coming out eventually. We're working on it. I didn't say anything about that, but yes. And the dragon thing will eventually come when I'm not doing the creepy monsters.
And maybe after grad school.
Check back with me in 3 years.
Kat.
Yeah, I'm Kat. You can find me on Twitter at Perpetual Gloom because I'm a big old goth. And if you want some more of my many, many, many classical Greek-inspired adventures, you can grab the Masks of Theros adventure path, which I co-wrote with Steffi Devan and Oliver Clegg and Beatrice Diaz and Christian Icon, which is currently $7 on the DMs Guild. That is a full levels 1 to 11 adventure path for $7 for the duration of Gen Con. Go buy my stuff.
And I'm Jess. Thank you so much for coming. You can find me on Twitter at miss_Jess03. Check out Uncaged Anthology on the DMs Guild or uncagеdanthology.com. I'm running Warhammer in an hour and a half, so if there's a spot for it, sign up for Night of Blood and play some games with me. And I'm the producer of Book of Seasons, which everybody here was in, so that's pretty cool. And yeah, I write games and stuff. Come check them out. Oh, and if you want to join and make some games with me, at least sign up for Folklore Jam 2020 and Fluffy Horror Jam on Itch, and we're gonna make some cool creepy folklore fluffy games together. Have a great rest of Gen Con. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us. Bye, everybody.